Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicole Desiato, and I'm the Marketing Manager for High School Social Studies. Welcome to the At Home Resources video series. Today, we'll examine the Great Depression and the New Deal and how it connects to the recent CARE Act and other stimulus packages passed in reaction to COVID-19. But before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders. To ensure audio quality, all of your audio has been muted, but we still can keep the lines of communication open. We really want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and comments. And there is a chat feature on GoToMeeting where you can enter questions and comments and send them privately to me. To be respectful of everyone's time today, I'm going to answer your questions via email after the session. We've also created a worksheet you can download now or at the end of the session to test your knowledge of the Great Depression. Now let's get started. Let's turn back the clock to 1929. The world has experienced a decade of economic prosperity after the bleakness of World War I. But in 1929, everything would come crashing down, and the world will spend the next decade in a Great Depression. How were people affected? How did the government step in to help? Over the next 20 minutes, you will learn what caused the Great Depression, what poverty was like for millions of Americans at this time, what was FDR's New Deal, who challenged the New Deal, and how you feel the New Deal has affected your lives today.
Have you ever heard of the Roaring Twenties? The 1920s were a time of unprecedented prosperity in the United States. Republicans, under the leadership of Presidents Harding and Coolidge, claimed credit for the economic boom. Herbert Hoover served as popular Secretary of Commerce for both Harding and Coolidge, so it was no surprise that he was nominated for president by the Republican Party in 1928. He won easily with his campaign, promising a chicken in every pot. The country was confident that a bright future was ahead. But even as Hoover gave his inaugural speech, the nation was headed toward a devastating economic collapse that would become known as the Great Depression. If you asked your parents or grandparents what caused the Great Depression, there's a good chance they'd say it was the infamous stock market crash of 1929. And they'd be right, or at least partly right. Economists can't agree on one cause. They believe several different economic problems contributed to the Depression. Here are some of them. During World War I, the nation's farmers had met the need for food by increasing production dramatically. To do this, they borrowed money to buy land and invest in new technology like tractors and combines. When the war ended, the demand for food fell, but productivity stayed high. This is a perfect example of supply and demand. When the supply of an item is scarce, the price goes up. After the war, supply exceeded demand and farmers couldn't earn enough money to pay for their loans or their mortgages on their farms. When you combine this with an epic drought, you have a recipe for economic disaster. These struggling farmers didn't enjoy the prosperity that the industrial workers and the wealthy did. The wages of industrial workers rose by 8% in the 1920s, and their productivity jumped by more than 30%. At the same time, corporate profits skyrocketed 65%. So, what does this all mean? By 1929, the distribution of wealth was lopsided. 60% of American families earned less than $2,000 a year, while a small number of families made at least 50 times that much. This meant the majority of people didn't have extra money to spend, and when people aren't buying products, the economy slows down. However, the availability of easy credit to buy homes, cars, and appliances hid the underlying weakness in the economy. The stock market crash of 1929 is thought of as the beginning of the Great Depression because it started a series of events that caused the U.S. economy to collapse. Within 3 years, almost 3,000 banks failed. Within 4 years, the unemployment rate was a staggering 25%. The Federal Reserve put in place measures that cut money supply and, according to some economists, only made things worse. The Depression spread to the rest of the world too, and it lasted until the early 1940s. Since then, the economy has had its ups and downs. In 2008, economic problems in the United States led the world into a Great Recession. Take a few minutes to research the economic definitions of depression and recession. How are they different? If you've ever seen the musical Annie, you've had your first introduction to the Great Depression. Annie sings, "It's a hard knock life for us." And the song refers not only to her life as an orphan, but to life in general during the Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the official beginning of the Great Depression, but the economic effects were felt much earlier by those who lived in rural America. Many were farmers who began to suffer financial trouble when World War I ended in 1918. After the war, the demand for commodities such as corn and wheat fell, and when it looked like things couldn't get any worse, a severe drought in the 1930s turned the Great Plains into a dust bowl. That caused the bottom to fall out of the commodities market. A bushel of wheat that had sold for $2.16 in 1919 sold for only 38 cents in 1932. The dry spell, coupled with the debts farmers had incurred when they increased production for the war, led to economic disaster. Between 1930 and 1934, more than 1 million farmers lost their property. The desperate living conditions in the Dust Bowl caused more than 800,000 people to migrate from the Great Plains. The dwindling population had a snowball effect and devastated the economies of small towns that relied on the trade of farm families for their survival. The stock market crash of 1929 deepened the troubles for rural towns and quickly affected the lives of people who lived and worked in the cities. In the 1920s, there had been an industrial boom throughout the country, in cities and towns alike. Unemployment was low and wages rose. But within 3 years of the crash, almost 1/4 of American workers were out of work. The unemployment rate for African American workers was nearly 50%. Those who were lucky enough to keep their jobs had their wages cut and their work hours shortened. Families were hurt no matter where they lived. Men who had been family breadwinners felt helpless to provide for their children. Some tirelessly sought work, some fell into shame and despair, and some abandoned their families. Men traveled from place to place, often jumping trains looking for work. Wives took in laundry and sewing or worked as domestic help, if they were lucky enough to find jobs. Hunger haunted American families as meat disappeared from the dinner table and water replaced milk. Bread lines offered private and public charitable handouts for some. In an effort to feed their families and pay the rent, some people sold their possessions. Many lost their homes and ended up living on the streets. Makeshift shanty towns, called Hoovervilles, after then-President Hoover, sprang up across the country. One of the largest was in New York City's Central Park. How do you think the typical family struggle during this desperate time in history might have affected their ability to grow or even stay together? In 1932, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt accepted the Democratic Party's nomination for president, he affirmed, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people." When he took office in 1933, Roosevelt knew that the American people needed to be reassured in terms that the ordinary person in the street or farmer in the field could understand. Here's what FDR said in his first inaugural speech.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
In a series of informal radio talks called Fireside Chats, Roosevelt laid out his plans for the New Deal. This was the first New Deal, consisting of a broad range of programs introduced in 1933 and 1934. It focused on the 3 R's of relief, recovery, and reform. In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt introduced and Congress passed 15 bills to provide relief for the suffering, recovery for the economy, and reforms to prevent future economic collapses. The day after Roosevelt took office, he called a special session of Congress and introduced the Emergency Banking Bill. It included a bank holiday that would close every bank in the country for 4 days, an action that could potentially alarm the American people. Would it cause panic? Would people run to their banks to pull out all their money? Roosevelt used his first fireside chat to explain the steps the government had taken to prevent bank runs. The 4-day holiday would give banking institutions time to get their affairs in order. When the banks reopened, Americans didn't rush to the banks because the president had gained the people's trust. One banking reform was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which insured people's bank deposit accounts for up to $5,000, and the establishment of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, helped reform the stock market. Farm prices had fallen sharply after World War I, and rural America was hurting. To put it simply, prices were low because farmers produced too much food. The Agricultural Adjustment Act reduced production by paying farmers to plant fewer crops and to kill excess livestock like cattle and pigs. This measure proved controversial because many Americans believed it was immoral to slaughter animals and destroy crops. But by 1934, prices for farm goods began to rise. The creation of the Civilian Conservation Corps and Public Works Administration provided millions of rural and urban jobs. Other programs helped many people keep their homes. The National Recovery Administration established minimum wages for workers and minimum prices for goods, resulting in higher wages for workers and more profits for corporations. The idea was that both groups would boost the economy by buying and making more products. FDR's New Deal set the stage for a dramatic shift in the potential power of government to influence the economy and society. In times of economic crisis, government intervention can prevent impending disaster, but also create deep political divisions among those that fear the power of a growing federal government. In the months and years to come, various New Deal critics would rise and speak out. What sorts of claims do you suppose opponents might be making? Aw, puppies! Cute, cuddly puppies! Who doesn't like puppies? Well, how about cat lovers? Or people allergic to dog fur? The point is, nothing is loved by everyone. President Roosevelt's New Deal was designed to relieve the pain felt by millions of people, rebuild confidence in the economy, and stimulate business. Something to please everyone, right? Not quite. Both conservatives and liberals opposed all or some of the programs the president pushed through Congress, but for different reasons. Generally, conservatives said the government was doing too much, and liberals said it was doing too little. Former President Herbert Hoover, a Republican and the man Roosevelt defeated in 1932, called the New Deal the most stupendous invasion of the whole spirit of liberty. A number of influential conservative Democrat critics of the New Deal, along with powerful business leaders, formed the American Liberty League in 1934. Their members included two former Democratic presidential nominees who felt Roosevelt had betrayed the Democratic Party's principle of limited federal government. Attacks came from the left as well. The Socialist Party's presidential candidate charged that Roosevelt, a wealthy man who was far removed from the economic hardship felt by most of the country, was only concerned with saving the banks and ensuring the profits of big business. The American Communist Party called the New Deal a capitalist ruse. Three prominent New Deal critics claimed to speak for poor America. Francis Townsend, a doctor from California, wanted the federal government to give $200 a month to every citizen over the age of 60. He believed these people would then spend their money and boost the economy. Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest, hosted a radio show with millions of listeners. He supported the New Deal at first, but came to believe that it didn't do enough. He began calling it the Raw Deal. His remarks became so controversial that church officials eventually forced him to end his broadcasts. Share Our Wealth was the solution championed by Louisiana Senator Huey Long. He wanted to impose high taxes on rich individuals and corporations and then distribute that money to poor Americans. Long was powerful enough to be a threat to Roosevelt in the next election, but in 1935 he was assassinated by one of his many political enemies. The biggest threat to the New Deal was the Supreme Court ruling that the Constitution did not grant the president power to regulate interstate commerce. The court also struck down the centerpiece of the New Deal legislation, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and found part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. In response, FDR proposed increasing the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to as many as 15. Since his appointees would be supporters of the New Deal, critics called his plan court packing. The plan got nowhere in Congress and did Roosevelt great political harm. What do you think? Did President Roosevelt's New Deal programs do only what had to be done, or did they threaten personal freedom? If you ever have time to go exploring in your town, county, or state, there's a good chance you may find an artifact of the New Deal. It could be a dam or a bridge, or maybe a park, library, or other public building built by the Public Works Administration or Works Progress Administration. The PWA and WPA created large public works projects that benefited communities across the nation. One icon of the New Deal achievements is the Hoover Dam, which spans the Colorado River on the Arizona-Nevada border. But the legacy of the New Deal goes even deeper than physical monuments. For one thing, the New Deal changed our concept of government. Before the Great Depression, the government had a laissez-faire or hands-off attitude toward the economy. New Deal programs gave the federal government great influence over American life. Government regulates business and banking through agencies such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Securities Exchange Commission, and Federal Housing Administration. These three agencies play a vital role in our modern economy by insuring bank deposits of individuals, regulating banks and stock markets, and helping people achieve the American dream of owning a home. The New Deal also greatly expanded the economic and social policy powers of the president and the executive branch, giving them too much power, according to those who oppose President Roosevelt's actions. On the other hand, FDR's unprecedented 4 terms in office led to the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 consecutive terms. Before the New Deal, only some war veterans received direct aid. But the many new economic relief programs added veterans assistance and transformed the government's interaction with its people. The ideas of federal minimum wage, unemployment insurance, and Social Security all came to fruition under the New Deal. It's hard to imagine not having these programs, but they continue to create political controversy to this day. Another New Deal concept, providing farm subsidies, was adopted as part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It too is still as controversial as it was during the Depression. Some of its critics say the New Deal turned the United States into a welfare state, where the government assumes responsibility for the welfare of its children, as well as its poor, elderly, sick, disabled, and unemployed. Others praise the social welfare programs, saying they provide a social safety net for the neediest of citizens. Take a moment to think about how the New Deal touches your life today. Do you check out books at a library or drive across a bridge built by the PWA or WPA? Do you work at a job that must pay at least the federal minimum wage? Did anyone in your family ever rely on unemployment insurance after being laid off?
Now that we've learned about the Great Depression and the New Deal, let's talk about what's happening in our world today. Since the COVID-19 crisis started in March, our lives are drastically different. People are no longer eating out, going to the movies, and traveling like they were in February. And this all has had a huge impact on our economy as people have seen their jobs disappear and businesses shut down. As we know, during the Great Depression, the government stepped in with the New Deal. Since the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen multiple stimulus packages passed to help our economy. Today, we're going to look at the CARES Act. On March 27th, Congress passed the CARES Act to help the economy during this crisis. This was an historic $2 trillion investment into the economy. But where does this money go? This helpful graphic from NPR separates the $2 trillion into 7 different areas, which we'll take a look at now. The largest portion of the stimulus package goes to individuals, Americans like you, me, your parents, who will all receive a one-time cash payment depending on their income. But this area does more than that. It also invests in unemployment benefits to help people who have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. Big corporations received $500 billion, and a lot of this was for airlines who have seen people stop traveling due to social distancing guidelines. The money given to these large companies comes with a few expectations. Number 1, that it will be paid back, and number 2, oversights, so companies will have to publicly disclose how they are spending this money to support their employees. The almost $400 billion to state and local governments is for help with community-level response efforts, like helping to support your schools, police officers, colleges, and even child care centers. Finally, the last big chunk of money is going to small businesses, companies with less than 500 people. These small businesses are truly the backbone of our national economy. The money for the small businesses is for them to stay open during the crisis and keep supporting their employees. The rest of the money, education, public health, and safety net buckets, are for hospitals, veterans, telehealth care, medicine, and other supplies like food stamps and food banks, student loan relief, and more. The CARES Act isn't the only stimulus package that has been passed. Many experts agree more investment into our economy is still to come, and our society could look very different on the other side of this crisis. In 2020, we still feel the effects of the New Deal legislation passed in the 1930s. How do you think our world is going to look like in 100 years, or even in 5 years? Download our worksheet and answer questions on how the New Deal connects to today. Thank you so much for joining today's session. We're working really hard at creating more of these at-home learning resources. Keep an eye out on our social media and our websites for more. After today's session, you will have the option to send us some feedback via a survey. Please let us know what your thoughts are and even give us suggestions on other topics you'd like to see us cover. Thank you again, and stay safe.